Hello everyone and welcome to the biology lecture series, and we are discussing the topic respiration. So in the previous lecture we have discussed about the respiration, how can we define respiration, then we talked about the metabolism, and then we talked about the types of the respiration. We talked about external, internal as well as the cellular respiration, and within cellular respiration we talked about the aerobic as well as the anaerobic respiration. Then we talked about how respiration takes place in plants because they don't have any specialized structures. Then we talked about the respiration in animals, and we started with the lower organisms, and then we studied about the respiration in annelids, in earthworm, in grasshopper, and then we studied about the respiration system in complex organisms such as humans. Okay, then we studied in detail about the aerobic respiration. What are the steps involved in the aerobic respiration? So there were 3 steps: glycolysis, Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain. And there is one linking step known as the oxidative decarboxylation that happens between the glycolysis and the Krebs cycle. Okay, and apart from this, we also discussed about the anaerobic respiration, which is also known as fermentation, and there are 2 types. First is the alcoholic, second is the lactic acid fermentation. Now, in this lecture, we will discuss about some important points such as tidal volume and residual volume and all. So we'll discuss the definition of all of these. Okay, and then later on we'll also study about the something about mechanism of gaseous exchange. Clear? Now let's start with this lecture. So let's study about some important points that are related to the topic respiration. So you have to remember these points, and you have to also remember the definition of all of these terms. So I'm introducing you in this lecture to some of the terms such as tidal volume and all. So you already know the diaphragm, it becomes flat during the inspiration and it becomes convex during the expiration. So this you have to remember. Okay, so these points you have to remember. They can ask you during what happens during inspiration and what happens to the diaphragm during the expiration. So diaphragm contracts and diaphragm relaxes. Okay, and because of this we inspire and we expire. We expire and we inspire. All right, so we have already studied in the previous lecture the diaphragm contracts. Okay, and the muscles also that are attached to the rib, it contracts. So because of the contraction, what happens? Okay, this we have already seen in the previous lecture. Now what is tidal volume? The volume of air inspired or expired. What is inspiration? Inspiration is the taking in of the oxygen rich air. This is known as inspiration. It is the taking in of oxygen rich air. Clear? And what is expiration? Expiration is the exhaling out, or you can say taking out of oxygen poor air, or you can say carbon dioxide rich air. Okay, the volume of air inspired or expired in the relaxed position. So you are not putting any effort, you are in the relaxed position. This is known as the tidal volume. Now it is around 500 ml. Clear? Now next is the residual volume. What is the residual volume? The air left in the whole respiratory tract after forceful expiration. This is known as the residual. So as the term suggests, residual also, if you know the English term, what is left over. Okay, so what happens when you forcefully expire, then also some air is left in the lungs, and this is known as the residual volume. So it is around 1.5 liters. All right, now the total lung capacity. What is total lung capacity? So the maximum amount of air the lungs can hold after forceful inspiration. This is known as the total lung capacity. Okay, it is about 56 liters. Clear? The next is the vital capacity. What is vital capacity? It is the maximum amount of air which can be breathed out through forceful expiration after a forceful inspiration. So whenever you put some effort, so you do a forceful inspiration, okay, and then you do a forceful expiration, okay. So during the forceful inspiration, the maximum amount of air inspired, or during the forceful expiration, the maximum amount of air that is expelled out of the body. This is known as the vital capacity. Now it is around 3.4 to 4.8 liters. Here, now vital capacity is more in athlete, mountain dwellers, as well as the non-smokers. And the total area for gas exchange provided by are 750 million alveoli. So in the lungs of the humans, 750 million alveoli are present, and these alveoli, okay, they are also known as the alveolar sacs. They contain the blood capillaries, and the exchange of gases takes place here. So this is also involved in the exchange of the gases. Okay, so what happens? The air reaches in the alveoli and it is then diffused into the blood capillaries. How it is transferred? By the process of simple diffusion. Okay, and what happens? The carbon dioxide from the blood, it will enter into the alveoli, and then what will happen? It will be expelled out of the body. And the total area for gas exchange provided by 750 million alveoli in two lungs, it is 100 sm. Okay, now in the cycle of inhalation and exhalation, repeated 15 to 18 times in a minute, about 500 ml of air is breathed in and out. All right, now in 24 hours, we breathe 1500 liters of the air. Okay, so if we talk about one day, which is 24 hours, we breathe about 1500 liters of the air. Now let's talk about the blood. Blood is the medium for the transport of the oxygen. So blood contains the pigment known as the hemoglobin, and hemoglobin can bind to different gases. So it can bind to oxygen also, it can bind to carbon monoxide also, it can bind to carbon dioxide also. Okay, so blood is a carrier for the gases as well as the nutrients, minerals and salts as well. Okay, so here we are talking about the gaseous exchange. So blood is the medium or the carrier for the transport of the oxygen from the respiratory organ to the different tissues, and carbon dioxide is brought back from the tissues to the respiratory organ. So what is happening? Blood is present in the blood capillaries, which is present where? In the alveoli. Okay, so this blood, it carries the oxygenated blood. So here oxygen will be, or oxygen will diffuse into the tissues. Okay, and in tissues there is a very high concentration of carbon dioxide, and this carbon dioxide is produced by respiration. All right, so this oxygen will be utilized during the respiration, and after respiration, what is produced? Carbon dioxide is produced, and then this carbon dioxide, this diffuses then into the blood. So this is how exchange of gases is happening here. And this is also known as the internal respiration. We have already talked about internal respiration. Okay, one was external respiration, which was between the environment and the organism. Then we have the internal respiration, where the exchange of gases takes place between the blood and the tissue. So during internal respiration, what happens? There is exchange of gases between what? Between the blood and the tissues. Okay, clear? Now what happens? What was in external respiration? External respiration, if we talk about, external respiration is the exchange of gases between the environment, you can say, or you can say the atmosphere and the organism. So what happens in external respiration? The atmospheric air, it enters into the lungs, and from the lungs it will finally enter into the blood. So what is happening here? From the environment or from the atmosphere, or you can say atmospheric air, it will enter into the lungs, and from the lungs it will enter into the blood. So this is known as the external respiration. And the third one is the cellular respiration. Now the oxygen has reached into the cells, then cellular respiration will take place within the cell. Here what will happen? The respiratory substrate or the assimilated food, it is oxidized by the process known as respiration, and it will produce carbon dioxide, which then diffuses into the blood and it is eliminated out of the body. Clear? Now, as much as 97% of the oxygen is transported from the lungs to the tissues in combination with the hemoglobin. So hemoglobin, this is an iron containing porphyrin ring. Okay, what is hemoglobin? Hemoglobin consists of an iron, and it also consists of a porphyrin ring. Okay, it consists of a porphyrin ring. It also consists of the protein globin. So one part is the heme part. So heme is made up of the porphyrin, and another part is the protein that is known as globin. Okay, and then if we combine both of these, we get the protein hemoglobin, that is the carrier of the oxygen. So the oxygen, it combines with the hemoglobin, and 97% of the oxygen which is transported from the lungs to the tissues is in combination with the hemoglobin, and only 2% is transported in the dissolved condition by the plasma. So plasma is also involved in the transport of the oxygen, but only 2% of the oxygen that is dissolved in the plasma is transported, or it is transferred from the lungs towards the tissues. Now, a normal person has about 15 grams of hemoglobin per 100 ml of the blood. Okay, so this hemoglobin is also important. And if there is a lack of this hemoglobin, then what happens? Then the person suffers with the anemia, and the person will feel very lethargic and very weak, because hemoglobin is a carrier of the oxygen. So oxygen won't be transported to the tissues, and the tissues require oxygen to carry out the respiration, and through respiration energy is generated. So if there is a lack of hemoglobin, then the person will feel lethargic. And in a normal person, 100 ml of the blood contains 15 gram of hemoglobin. Clear? Now 1 gram of hemoglobin, it binds to 1.3 ml of oxygen. Clear? So you can calculate, in a normal person, 100 ml of blood contains 15 gram. So 1 gram contains 13.4. So in 100 ml, how many ml of oxygen can be carried? Clear? Now, and if you know the amount of blood present in a human, then you can calculate the amount of oxygen also that blood can carry. So 100 ml of blood carries 20 ml of the oxygen, which is generated in the tissues. It diffuses into the blood and it combines with the hemoglobin. So hemoglobin is also the carrier of the carbon dioxide. Now, when a respiring tissue, it releases carbon dioxide by the process of respiration, it first diffuses in the plasma. From here, it diffuses into the red blood cells. So first, what happens? Blood has two components, plasma and the cellular components. So plasma, what is plasma? It is free of the cellular component. Okay, it is free of the cellular components. What are the cellular components? Cellular components are your RBCs, WBCs. Okay, if we talk about the cellular component, these are RBCs, WBCs, as well as the blood platelets. Okay, so plasma doesn't contain these cellular components, but these cellular components, it float in the plasma. Okay, Now, what happens? The carbon dioxide first diffuses into the plasma and then it diffuses into the red blood cell. Now, carbon dioxide is transported from the tissues to the lungs in the form of bicarbonate dissolved in the water. Okay, so whenever carbon dioxide, okay, it mixes with water. So carbon dioxide first mixes with water and then what is formed? Bicarbonate. So carbon dioxide is not transferred in the gaseous form. It combines with the water and then it is transported in the form of bicarbonate. What is bicarbonate? HCO3 negative. This is bicarbonate. Okay. Now, about 23% of carbon dioxide entering into the erythrocytes, it combined with the globin protein. So I've already told you hemoglobin, it is made, one component is the heme, another component is the globin. So globin is a protein, and if there is a defect in this globin genes, such as in sickle cell anemia, so there is a you can say some change in this globin protein, and that cause the erythrocytes to become sickle shaped. So this is what happens in the sickle cell anemia. So 23% of the carbon dioxide, it binds with the globin protein, okay, which is a part of the hemoglobin to form carb amino hemoglobin, which is transported to the lungs. Okay, so where does carbon dioxide bind? It binds to the globin part of the hemoglobin, and whenever carbon dioxide bind to the globin, then it is known as carb amino hemoglobin. Okay, and in this form, carbon dioxide is transported to the lungs. Okay. Now, carbon monoxide can also bind to the hemoglobin, and its binding is about 230 times more readily than the oxygen also. So we have already studied in the previous lectures what is the most stable complex formed by the hemoglobin. So most stable, or the question was, among these gases, which of the gases form most stable compounds? The option was carbon dioxide, oxygen, monoxide, and nitrogen. So monoxide was the answer here, because the binding affinity between the carbon dioxide and the hemoglobin is very high, and it is about 23 times more than the binding capacity of the oxygen. That's why carbon monoxide and hemoglobin, they form the most stable complex. Okay, they form the most stable complex. Here, whenever carbon dioxide bind to hemoglobin, what is called carboxyhemoglobin. Now, when a person inhales carbon monoxide, it diffuses from the alveolar air to the blood. Okay, so because of the air pollution, there is a lot of carbon monoxide in the air, and this carbon monoxide is now enters into your lungs, and from the lungs it will enter into the alveoli, and within the alveoli you have the blood capillaries which carries the blood, and from the blood, okay, it will then enter into your system, and so the carbon monoxide diffuses into the alveolar air to the blood, and then carbon monoxide enters into the blood and it binds to the hemoglobin, forming carboxyhemoglobin. Okay, now the latter is relatively stable compound and cannot bind with the oxygen. So latter means the carboxyhemoglobin. Okay, this is a very stable compound. It cannot bind with the oxygen. Now, so the amount of hemoglobin available for oxygen transport is reduced. So, thus resulting, so the resulting deficiency of oxygen causes headache, dizziness, nausea, and even death. Clear? Now, let's talk about some of the terms related to this lack of oxygen. First is the mountain sickness. So, it is also known as the altitude sickness. Now, at sea level, the concentration of the oxygen is about 21%, and the barometric pressure averages 760 millimeter of mercury. Okay, so hemoglobin, I've told you, was hemoglobin is represented by Hb, not Hg. Okay, so hemoglobin is Hb and mercury is Hg. So hemoglobin is abbreviated by Hb and Hg is for the mercury. Okay, now as altitude increases, the concentration remains the same, but the number of oxygen molecules per breath is reduced. Now at 12,000 feet, the barometric pressure is only 483 millimeter of the mercury. So there are roughly 40% fewer oxygen molecules per breath. Clear? Now in order to oxygenate the body effectively, breathing rate, even while at rest, it has to be increased. This extracellular ventilation increases the oxygen content in the blood but not sea level concentration. Now the fall in the oxygenation of the blood, it produces the symptoms of the mountain sickness. So this is how you get the mountain sickness. And what are the symptoms of the mountain sickness? It is breathlessness, headache, dizziness, nausea, vomiting, mental fatigue, and a bluish tinge present on the skin, nails, as well as the lips. Okay. Now let's study about the control of respiration. We have already talked about this in the previous lecture, how the respiration is controlled. So respiration is controlled by the respiratory center that is present in the medulla oblongata of the brain, especially in the hind brain. Okay. Now what happens under normal conditions? The rate of breathing is 15 to 18 times per minute. And you know, breathing is an involuntary process. So you don't have to think whenever you breathe, and this is controlled by the autonomous nervous system. Controlled by the autonomous nervous system. Now under normal condition, rate of breathing is 15 to 18 times per minute. And during the vigorous exercise, the demand of oxygen increases. Why? Due to which the rate of the breathing increases by about 20 to 30 times. Now, the total area of gas exchange covered through 300 million alveoli is about 36 to 72 meters square in each lungs. Clear? So in control of respiration, you can write that the respiration is controlled by the respiratory center, which is present in the medulla oblongata. Alright, so what happens whenever there is a change in the pH of the blood? That is due to the presence of the carbon dioxide and the protons. So the pH of the blood depends on the carbon dioxide and the protons. So whenever there is a change in the concentration of these two, then what happens? Some chemoreceptors are activated and they further activate the respiratory centers present in the medulla oblongata, and the regulation of the or the control of the respiration can be done. Clear? So this was the end of this session. Hope you enjoyed it, and we'll talk about rest of the topics in the next session. Thank you very much for listening.